will once again thank Pradeep for his kind introduction and all the officers of the Stanford Parents Club, and thank all of you for sending your kids to us. They're amazing students, and for being so supportive of Stanford. I have a PowerPoint slideshow that I would like to share with you, if you'll permit me to do so. The way I do these slides is, probably a little over ambitious, so I won't go through all of the points in them, but I'm happy to share them with anyone who would like them. We live, as you know, particularly as we are less than 4 weeks away from a very consequential and polarizing election. We live in a democracy that is increasingly challenged, and one of the most serious and sobering ways that it is challenged is by the deepening levels of political polarization, particularly on partisan lines, the growing gulf both at the level of politicians and even at the level of ordinary citizens between people who identify with one or the other of the two major political parties in the United States. I have data that could demonstrate these points, but I'll simply say, by way of summary of what I think most of us sense or know, that the Congress in its voting behavior has become much more polarized along partisan and ideological lines. And this has really, I think, poisoned our politics to a considerable degree and complicated the search for solutions for the challenges we face abroad and particularly at home. The mass public has also become much more polarized on ideological and partisan lines, but trust me when I say this, if you look at the preferences of the people and the voting behavior of the Congress, the people are not as polarized as the Congress. And that's actually a very hopeful statement. That is where I'm heading. Because if we can change the incentive structure of the Congress to reflect at least some of the residual desire of the American people for more bridging, more compromise, more moderation, and more pragmatism in our politics and less partisanship, we can actually repair and improve our democracy. And that's where I'm heading. Part of the problem is that people who are more engaged in politics, who tend to vote, for example, in party primaries, are not representative of the overall electorate. They are actually more partisan and more ideological. And so that creates a problem in terms of party primaries. And the consequences of this are pretty dreadful in terms of how Americans feel about their democracy. 2/3 of them have said that they think our country is in crisis in terms of its democracy and at risk of failing. Many reject the legitimacy of the last presidential election and show little confidence in the integrity of the coming one. And a growing number of Republicans and Democrats each view the other party not just as a political opposition with different policies and programs. They may be wrong, they may not have performed well, but they're not evil. Rather, too many partisans on each side are coming to view the others as enemies, as existential threats to American democracy and the American way of life. And this seems to be contributing to a growing readiness to tolerate or even potentially engage in political violence. So it's getting very dangerous. There are a lot of social drivers and economic drivers of our polarization that have to do with growing inequality in wealth and income, growing insecurity in terms of people's jobs and savings, inflation, and economic insecurity all fall into one basket. Then there's, the challenge of adjusting to becoming a more diverse society. And it's hard for that to happen overnight. And so immigration is, of course, as you know, a hot button issue and poses challenges in a number of communities. We live with the history and moral and social burden of racism, slavery, and its legacies and continuing inequalities based on race and wealth and income and racial bias and policing and so on. And then, the other things you see here, including the polarizing effect of social media, which has been absolutely toxic, and the decline of civic education in the United States, which actually you can ask President Levin about this when you meet with him in about 50 minutes. And it's such an honor to be able to speak to you in advance of President Levin's maiden voyage with one of our most prominent support communities at Stanford. The result, as you can see here, if you look at our peer democracies around the world on a kind of 0 to 100 scale of democratic health and quality as measured annually by Freedom House, the United States has been in very considerable decline for some years now, really since about 2010, when this partisan polarization really began to become intense. And we trail most of our advanced industrial democratic peers. So how can we repair the situation? Well, we can, and the good news is have been strengthening the impartiality and capacity of electoral administration. Now, that may seem an odd thing to say when we've got, some very partisan electoral officials seeming to perhaps manipulate the rules for advantage here. But on the whole, we've made real progress on the technical side and on the administrative side. And unfortunately, it hasn't quite filtered down into adequate appreciation at the level of the ordinary voter in both political parties for the integrity of the electoral process. We have a lot of work to do in that regard. We still have more work to do to make it easier to register and vote. This is something that all of our peer democracies do as a kind of reflex. It's not a political issue. I am going to focus on two reforms that I think could transform political polarization in the United States, and they are ranked choice voting and putting an end to partisan party primaries. So on the right to vote, these are key principles for fair elections that, I think we've been trying to get to for some time. And I think there are some reforms that would help here. I don't believe that the chief electoral officer of a state should be a partisan electoral official. Many of you are from California probably and know that in California we elect the Secretary of State, and sometimes that person goes on to be governor. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, was Secretary of State administering the elections, and indeed he administered the election that he ran in to become governor of Georgia 6 years ago. I think these people generally do a conscientious job, but it's a vulnerability in this system, and it's a problem of perception that shouldn't be there. We also shouldn't have a system where politicians are choosing their voters by drawing their own electoral districts. This is, I think, a real obscenity in terms of democratic principle. And the courts have generally allowed it, which I think is unfortunate, but maybe consistent with the wide latitude the Constitution gives the states in this regard. The voters can end this in 24 states by passing ballot propositions, as we've done in California and as a few other states have done, to require nonpartisan independent commissions to redraw electoral district boundaries. And this is making some progress around the country. There are other reforms you can see here, as well as the need, I think, for continued federal assistance to ensure the neutrality and technical capacity of electoral administration. I want to highlight the final bullet point here. One of the most sobering features of the moment we are at, reflective of the high level of distrust, anxiety, and polarization, is the threats of violence and the intimidation and the ugliness, rhetorically and emotionally, that's been visited upon neutral, professional, or volunteer election officials. And I think it should be a federal crime to threaten the safety or security of an election official or their family. We've taken steps, as I've said, to modernize our voting machines and ensure that they all have an auditable paper trail. No election should ever be held in any jurisdiction of consequence that can't allow for a recount with a paper record of the ballots. And this is why I'm totally opposed to internet voting. And so we've been replacing voting machines that don't provide that with voting machines that do. And a lot of skeptics about election integrity have been pushing for risk limiting audits as a routine practice. And I'm less skeptical than they are, but I still favor it. Anything we can do to do a kind of random sample of the ballots and make sure that the count that they produce matches the count that the machine produced. The Electoral Reform Act, the Electoral Count Reform Act, which is really focused on the Electoral College and the presidential election, passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law in 2022, has really given us some protection against the crisis we faced at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. It clarifies that the role of the vice president is purely ceremonial. It expedites judicial review of election disputes, provides a mechanism once the courts have ruled to kind of get certainty about who are the presidential electors in each state, and makes it more difficult for each house to object to a slate of electors. There's more we could do on a national level to enshrine and protect voting rights with the federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court in the last decade, having weakened, unfortunately, in my view, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But the Congress is very divided on this issue. I think we should fully restore that act and add a few key national principles that some states are adopting, such as automatic voter registration, the so-called motor voter law, making it easier to vote by mail with or early voting. I have no problem on the other side with people saying, okay, but the ballot should have to be received by election day. I think people should be able to organize themselves if they're going to vote by mail, to put the ballot in the ballot box early enough so that it reaches the registrar of voters by election day. And I would favor making voting day a national holiday, which, by the way, we do at Stanford now with the Democracy Day. The Faculty Senate voted a few years ago to not have classes on election day so that students and faculty could feel free, be free to work at the polls, to work in voter turnout, and to reflect on the importance of this day. A potential compromise for this might be to require a photo ID, which skeptics are demanding, but really work over a long period of time to ensure that all citizens of voting age, however poor, rural, and kind of on the margins they may be in terms of their livelihoods, can get access to this. Now, polarization, our fractured Congress, our fractured society. What can we do about it? Well, recall what I said, the actual hopeful statement that the Congress is more divided than the American people are. And why is this? The fundamental reason is that we have a two-party system, in essence. It's a duopoly. Minor parties and candidates face very little prospect of winning an election that is a so-called first past the post election, where whoever gets the most votes in a district wins. And so people feel, well, I might like to vote for an independent who's taking a fresh look at things and isn't far to the left or far to the right, or maybe I'm a libertarian. Maybe I really like the Green Party. Maybe there's, I don't know, our former representative here in the Stanford district some time ago, Tom Campbell, is the ancient dinosaur of a moderate Republican. And he started a political party in California. I think it's called the Common Sense Party. But, how can any of these startups really get a chance in a single member district system where people know that, it's probably going to be a Republican or Democrat who wins? And if they take a flyer on somebody else, they're probably just wasting their vote. There's a solution to this problem. It's very simple. It's very exciting. I think it's very democratic, and I'll unveil it to you in a moment. We also face the interaction of this first past the post system with party primaries in most states, no longer in California. And think about it. Party primaries take place 2, 3, 5, 6 months in advance of the general election. Who is most motivated to turn out in a primary election months in advance of the general election? It's people who are more motivated because they identify more strongly with their party, and they tend to have stronger ideological positions. So what's happening is that in many states, only 20, 25% of the electorate turns out in a primary election. And that means, let's say one political party, maybe they have 15% of the electorate turning out to vote in their party primary. And it means the 8% of voters who are most ideologically committed on that side can determine who's the winner of the party primary. And a lot of states, if you win a party primary, you've in essence won the general election. Try to remember, I challenge you to do so, the last time a Republican was elected statewide in California. So maybe there's a better way by having nonpartisan primaries. Now, I want to come first to the better way of doing it than first past the post. It's a way that's used in San Francisco, a number of Bay Area cities, including Oakland, and now in 2 different states of Maine and Alaska, with growing interest around the country. It's used in Minneapolis and St. Paul and a growing number of other cities. It's called ranked choice voting. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Ranked choice voting requires that the winner of an election win a majority of the vote. and or at least of the surviving vote if there are runoff elections. But unlike some systems, states, or countries, the runoff doesn't happen in a second election, which asks a lot of voters because they have to turn out again and can be very expensive. It happens instantly, and it may happen in multiple rounds. People rank their choices 1, 2, 3, 4. And if nobody gets a majority of the vote, person with the lowest number of first preference votes is eliminated, as you see here in this simulation, candidate E. Candidate E's votes are redistributed to the voters' second preferences. And then you see, has someone emerged with a majority? And if not, these elimination rounds and redistributions of the preferential votes happen until someone emerges in the final round with a majority. Now, this can seem unfair because, as you see in this simulation, it allows for the possibility that the candidate who did not get the most support on the first round may actually win. On the other hand, that candidate may win because she's more broadly appealing to the electorate than a highly polarizing candidate who just wants to kind of narrowcast their appeal to a militant base. And so if your goal is to have a more broadly inclusive outcome that better reflects all the preferences of the electorate, or if your goal is to simply overcome polarization, I have come to believe very strongly that ranked choice voting is a better system. It is also, I think, more democratic because people can signal their real preferences. They don't have to be trapped by the spoiler problem that if they don't vote for one of the two most likely possibilities, they'll be wasting their vote. They can use their first preference vote to signal their sincere intent. Take a flyer on a startup, and if that candidate doesn't make it and nobody wins, their second preference will then become consequential. They're not disenfranchised. It encourages coalition formation because then candidates, we see this in a lot of municipal elections, need to appeal for the second preference votes of other candidates, and they may form reciprocal bargains. It also, we find from some tantalizing early evidence, leads to less negative campaigning. And that makes sense because, you know, if you want to win the second preference votes of a number of your rivals, you don't want to trash those candidates with negative campaigning early on. If we had partisan primaries, I would favor getting rid of the sore loser rule that says if you lose a party primary, you can't run back, come back and run as an independent in the general election. And this could be done with ranked choice voting as well, but I favor a different system. And the different system is called top 4 or top 5. And it uses a nonpartisan primary in which everybody can vote: Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, Common Sense, Socialist. It doesn't matter what you are. You vote for your most favored candidate in the primary. Now, in California and in the state of Washington, the top 2 candidates advance to the general election. That tilts things a little bit toward moderation. Sometimes you'll get 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans running against one another, and maybe the more moderate one will win. But really, it doesn't help very much. And I think it narrows the field too early in the arc of an election campaign. My preference is for the system that Alaska adopted in 2020 and used for the first time in 2022, called top 4. Under this system, a nonpartisan primary advances the top 4 finishers to the general election. And then those top four contest in a ranked choice voting in the general election. Nevada adopted or voted for in 2022 in a state referendum a version of this called top five. The top five finishers would advance to the general election for Congress and all state offices. But the Nevada Constitution requires that a constitutional amendment be approved in two successive elections. So Nevada voters will be voting again in 26 days on whether to adopt top five as their new system of voting. Top five primary, ranked choice voting in the general election. Fortunately, 23 states have the voter initiative, and the voters can take this question in hand to try to get ranked choice voting. That's how it was adopted in the state of Maine in 2018, in Alaska in 2020. It failed in Massachusetts that year. It won in Nevada, and then it's been winning in a number of cities as well. I want to conclude with what's happening this year. This is the angle on the American election, general election in November of this year, that I'm going to guess, unless you live in Colorado or live in Oregon or live in Nevada or live in Idaho, which also has top four option on the ballot this year as a voter initiative, you don't know about these efforts. But in 5 states, Alaska, with a voter initiative pushed by one of the political parties to repeal top four, and Nevada, Colorado, Oregon, which is a more traditional style ranked choice voting with party primaries. If ranked choice voting wins in several of these states, and you've now got, in 2026, 4 or 5 states using ranked choice voting, and especially with nonpartisan primaries, we may find that this is an idea whose time has come. And we have seen with other political reforms in the United States, including the adoption of party primaries in the 20th century and greater inclusion of voters through a variety of means, that often the way reform happens politically in the United States, it's not always from the top down through national legislation. Often it's from the bottom up, with voters mobilizing at the grassroots for a political reform, getting it on the ballot, and then waging a principled campaign for a change that, in this case, I really do believe could give us some relief from our toxic and suffocating partisan polarization.
Thank you, Professor Diamond. I think we have several questions coming in. So, so first one is, what's your point of view of the utility, necessity, or legitimacy of the Electoral College?
Well, I don't like the Electoral College, and I don't like it as a matter of principle. It's got nothing to do with Democrat, Republican, whatever, who it favors at one point in time. I believe that democracy is about popular sovereignty. If you're going to have a presidential system, and we could debate whether that's a good thing, but I think we have a presidential system and we're not going to change it in the United States. The president should be chosen, as the president is in all other democracies today that have an executive presidency, by popular vote. I think the Electoral College is antiquated. It's a political bargain which was struck at a particular point in time in American history to enable the American Democratic Republic to get off the ground and include all 13 emerging states. But it is, in my opinion, undemocratic. That said, it isn't going anywhere. I can tell you the only way it can be really eliminated in favor of the national popular vote is through a constitutional amendment. I do not believe that is plausible in my lifetime, and so I want to focus on other things. I know, some of you may know, some of you may be thinking, what about the National Popular Vote Compact? That's a political bargain that's been struck among various states in the United States that says when a number of states whose electoral college votes total a majority of the electoral college, 270 or more, all pass the same law that says we will give our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote and not necessarily the person who won the vote in our state. When that happens, won't that eliminate the electoral college? And my answer is twofold. Number one, what is given by a state legislature can be taken away by a state legislature. It's not a very durable solution. And number two, I have a very strong suspicion that it would be invalidated by the Supreme Court. So I think we need to focus on other issues.
Okay, the other question is you showed a chart where compared to other first world democracies, the US has been declining. So what steps did the other countries take to improve their democratic processes? Like, did they adopt ranked choice voting or other things?
Oh, this is a great question. I love this question because for most of my career, I've studied democracy comparatively rather than just in the United States. So I like to point to the example of Australia because, there are interesting similarities between Australia and the United States. Of course, there's a difference in scale that's overwhelming. But Australia is a former British colony like the US. Australia inherited the British system, the British electoral system of first past the post. Of course, it's a parliamentary system rather than a presidential system. But Australia isn't nearly as politically polarized as the United States. And here's two important reasons why. First of all, and most importantly, Australia has ranked choice voting for the lower house of parliament, who chooses the prime minister, and a form of ranked choice voting with proportional representation for their Senate. And ranked choice voting, Australian scholars believe, has actually really worked to temper extremism and give some boost to more moderate, compromising, less toxically partisan candidates. The second thing Australia has that the United States doesn't is compulsory voting. You're actually required to vote, and you may have to pay a small fine if you don't come to the polls. Now, you may think, why would that be moderating? Wouldn't that bring crazy militant people to the polls who'd otherwise stay home? And the answer is no. The research is actually pretty decisive in Australia, but suggestive elsewhere, that the people who don't vote have left strong convictions about the issues. Okay, they have lower information, lower motivation, but they're also less polarized. And so they tend to have a leavening influence and to also contribute to moderation. Now, our deliberative democracy lab at Stanford, in the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, where I sit, has been doing deliberative polls on a variety of issues for a number of years now, to not only find out what people think, but also, after they get briefed and talk about the issues with one another, what they would think if they had a chance to weigh these various options with their fellow voters. And we did a deliberative poll last June of 2023 on support for all of these democratic reforms and many others as well, including one I'll talk about in a minute. And there was a very significant increase in support for ranked choice voting. By the end of the deliberation, a majority of our random sample supported moving to ranked choice voting. There was also an increase, but to a lower level, in support for the other way that people vote around the world, which is proportional representation. And I'll come to that. At the beginning of our deliberation, I think slightly less than 20% of our sample of American voters supported compulsory voting. And at the end of the deliberation, the same small minority was all that was in supportive of compulsory voting. I think this is a hill too far to climb for the American electorate, which doesn't like compulsion. The option of proportional representation is you give people party lists, and the parties nominate a list of candidates. Maybe you have, instead of one person being elected in a congressional district, you have 5 people being elected in a congressional district. Each party nominates a slate of candidates, and each party gets a percentage of seats equivalent to its share of the vote. So, you know, in Massachusetts, you wouldn't have all 8 members of Congress being Democrats. Republicans would probably win a couple of seats. In the Bay Area, you know, you wouldn't have the entire Bay Area represented by Democrats. You'd probably have, in proportional terms, 1 or 2 Republicans. So you'd get, you know, more balance, be fair in that sense, at least at the state level. But you're asking parties to nominate candidates and to have people vote in a very conscious party line way. And there is some danger that this could reinforce polarization. It's not the reform I favor, at least not at the national level.
Okay, so do you think it is possible for us in the presidential election to have ranked choice voting, and what would it take?
Oh, sure. In fact, one of the states that has ranked choice voting on the ballot as a voter initiative this year, I think it's Oregon, but don't hold me to that. But one of them provides for ranked choice voting for the presidency. Now, bear in mind that the Constitution gives each state the ability to determine how its electors will be chosen. We're long past the day, we're about 200 years past the day, when any method other than the popular vote would determine how a state will choose its electors. So at the state level, we have the popular vote for president. But states are still constitutionally free to say, we will not choose our presidential candidate, the person who's going to win our state's electoral college votes, by first past the post. We'll choose it by ranked choice voting. So imagine it's Florida 2000, and you have George Bush, Al Gore, Ralph Nader, and maybe somebody else on the ballot, and nobody gets a majority of the vote. The candidate with the lowest number of votes, which would have been Ralph Nader, would be eliminated, and the person who would win the electoral votes would be whoever emerges in the instant runoff. And this could work either way in different states. So it can be done, but it would have to, unless we have national legislation mandating this, and given the scope that the Constitution gives to states to determine this, I'm not sure it would be constitutional for the Congress to mandate this. It's really going to be decided at the state level, and you could have different systems in different states.
Okay. Nearly everyone calls the United States a democracy, but we are a constitutional republic. Please explain the difference.
Well, I just articulated one of the dimensions in which that's true. We don't have a national popular vote. We have several features of the American Constitution that have counter-majoritarian tendencies. And the principal ones are the Electoral College and the US Senate, which is vastly disproportional in its representation of different states, and which I think over time has become even more unfair in that regard as the population disparities have grown, say between a small state like Rhode Island and a big state like Texas. And we also still have the Senate filibuster as long as it lasts, and so on and so forth. But this raises important philosophical questions. I believe that the Constitution should be and can be a fully democratic document. Certainly, the American people believe and intend for the United States to be a democracy, albeit with some of the distinctive features that I've articulated. So, I do not sympathize with the view that, which I'm not suggesting was the intent of the commentator, that because we are a constitutional republic, we are not or should not aspire to be a democracy. We are a constitutional democratic republic, and a republic in the sense that we don't have a monarchy or a king or some other unelected paramount authority. We have popular sovereignty.
Okay, here's a question about absentee voting. Would it work in a ranked choice voting system?
Yeah, of course. Absentee voting can work in any system, PR, ranked choice voting, or so on. Now, the question is actually an astute one, because it's quite easy, to program voting machines so that you not only can enable people to rank their choices 1, 2, 3, 4, but the computer in the machine will compute the winner more or less instantaneously. Once you have a lot of paper ballots, it'll take a bit longer to do the count. But this could be done by punch cards or optical scanning. So I think that we're now moving after Florida 2000 away from punch cards to the kind of black marks and optical scanning that we have in California, So the answer is it's fully compatible.
Okay. And here's a question. The Washington Post says that the Republicans are now challenging the legitimacy of overseas votes. Uh, and they're asking a federal judge to set aside these ballots until voter eligibility can be determined. Is this likely to impact the election?
Uh, well, I'm looking at the question. The federal judge that ruled was in Pennsylvania. That would only apply as a ruling to the state of Pennsylvania, I think, unless the Supreme Court ruled. Pennsylvania is a battleground state. The presidency of the United States could well be determined by a margin of 20 or 30,000 votes in Pennsylvania. So, could it affect the outcome of the election? It is certainly plausible that it could, if the overseas votes skew a certain way. Now, the questioner said this would include military votes. Of course, those are also overseas votes. In the past, those have skewed in one direction. Other overseas votes have skewed in the other direction. So it isn't clear, who would be advantaged by setting them aside to determine voter eligibility. Um, I don't really understand this controversy because to vote overseas, you need to receive an absentee ballot, right? And a paper absentee ballot is sent to you. And so it would only be sent to you if you are a registered voter. So is the lawsuit suggesting that we're going to have the overseas posts of the FBI visit the overseas address of every voter overseas to determine and interview them as to whether they really cast that ballot? I mean, I think this is absurd and unnecessary. And like many of the challenges that have been posed over the years, is based on a concern for which there is no evidence that there is a problem.
So in one-party jurisdictions like San Francisco, Oakland, Minneapolis, has the ranked choice voting had a moderating influence on the far left?
Yes, I think it did in San Francisco last time. London Breed was probably the most moderate of the remaining principal candidates. And my prediction is you're going to see it again in the result in San Francisco, where there are candidates that are more on the left end of the political spectrum. But I don't think they're going to be able to scale the hurdle of winning a majority of the vote in a ranked choice election.
How
So there is some interesting emerging evidence at the municipal level that ranked choice voting, uh, you know, favors moderation, and it certainly did in the Alaska senatorial election last go round in 2022, where the moderate kind of centrist Republican incumbent, Lisa Murkowski, was reelected. And if you'd had a partisan primary and first past the post, she would not have been reelected.
yeah. There's a comment from somebody in Boulder, Colorado, and said that they've had experience with ranked choice voting in the mayoral election in 23, and the result was more moderate.
Mm-hmm.
So who was the first to the post actually lost.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Question about filibuster, should it be removed?
I as a matter of principle, I think it would be better not to have it. But, you know, in the current era of intense political polarization and extremely high stakes, this may not be the moment to go to a purely majoritarian system. Part of the problem we have in the Congress now is a lack of trust between the two political parties and a sense of existential fear that if one side wins and has unitary power, they'll use it to extinguish the interests and maybe the political viability of the other side. And, quote, things will never be the same. And the filibuster provides some measure of reassurance to each of the maybe more committed partisans in each party that there'll be some checks and balances, even if one political party wins the presidency, the House, and the Senate. They're very unlikely to win 60 senators. I would not prioritize this right now, and I would put it, you know, down the road once we change the electoral system in ways that induce more moderation. If you don't mind me pulling out a question that was asked, Pradeep, because it's something I also feel strongly about. The question is about Supreme Court term limits. And this is actually part of my presentation when I have more time to present. I actually favor and have long favored the proposal for an 18-year term limit for the Supreme Court and having a president nominate a justice every 2 years, the first and third year of their terms. I think the Supreme Court has become highly politicized and the process has been heavily gamed in a way that isn't healthy. You know, presidents are reaching down into the federal appellate courts to choose younger and younger justices so that they can be on the bench longer and longer. And again, the stakes become higher and higher because that person may be on the bench for 30. In the case of Amy Coney Barrett, I wouldn't be surprised, 40 years. She's a remarkably vigorous, healthy individual who took the bench when, you know, I think she hadn't quite turned 50. So I would favor this system. We're trying to move toward it. I think it would be more democratic. The US is the only democracy in the world that has neither term limits nor an age limit for its Supreme Court or Constitutional Court justices. Having reached a certain age, not that big a fan of age limits, but I think term limits would make a lot of sense. I think a president should be able to choose a 60 or 62-year-old federal appellate court judge as a Supreme Court justice and not worry, oh, am I selling out my party by choosing someone who's, you know, maybe only going to be there 15 or 20 years. Let them be there 18 years and let everybody know that this is the system that will be equally available to Democrats and Republicans going forward.
What about the national holiday on election day? Do you think it'll actually improve voting turnout?
I think it would. A lot of the evidence shows that it would. And I will say again, with our now Vice Provost, Patrick Dunkley, having joined us and are awaiting the great opportunity to hear from our new Stanford president, that I think Stanford can take enormous pride in having adopted Democracy Day, giving our students and faculty a day off from formal classes and teaching to engage in the democratic process. It would not only make it easier for people to vote, Pradeep, and I think significantly expand voter turnout just from that perspective, it would also make it easier for a lot of people to volunteer to work at the polls because they wouldn't be having to take a day off from work to do that. Now, some companies and employers will give people the day off if they work at the polls. But it should be a national holiday, I think.